أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم من همزه ونفخه ونفثه بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسولنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Okay, so the checking questions are: how are you? How are you deep down inside? So it's not a surface question, it's a deep level question. And how do you see or evaluate yourself? In other words, if you were a third person that was evaluating you, how would you grade yourself? What assumptions are embedded in your rubric or grading system? What are things that are assumptions that you don't know the capital T truths of, or maybe you do but you haven't yet incorporated them, that you're using in the rubric currently? Do you grade or update your assumptions? In other words, if you've had assumptions, do you go back and evaluate those assumptions and update them, or are they just sitting there for some time and you haven't evaluated them or updated them yet? In other words, not just evaluating yourself, but also the criteria itself. So this is what we're continuing with, and as we continue, this review of this stuff. Right now we're focusing a lot on how things work, because if we put down goals and stuff that are not realistic, then that really and they have a lot of assumptions in them, then we can actually burn out really quickly and we're not going to be able to move forward. So having the understanding about how things work, how to think, how not to think and stuff, is going to help us in terms of actually breaking down our the path towards our goals into checkpoints or mile markers and so on. And then after that, focusing on more nuanced day-to-day stuff. And then this is just a review of this. Okay, and now some brain games. But as usual, we have something beforehand. So, or at least recently. So, we have some video over here. Let me get my mouse here.
Front furbo is about to become part of an
well, except maybe it's the mother of all questions. Well, except maybe what's the meaning of life, which we actually have our own scientific answers to. Or what is love? We have some thoughts on that too. But one of the most Googled questions in the English-speaking world is the one that kids are famous for asking and grown-ups are notorious for avoiding because they just don't know. Why is the sky blue?
All right, so the question is, why is the sky blue? So what are your answers to that before we get into anything else? So again, you're looking at the world and you're just kind of figuring out how things work. And one of the things you see is, oh, look, the sky is blue. Now the question is, why? So this is, again, we're evaluating how knowledge works, and so we're giving an example of that. So why is the sky blue? What are your thoughts on this? What are the possibilities that we can list out, and which of them then can we explore further to see if that's the possibility? So one of the responses, Allah that I created it that way. Absolutely. But why is it blue? in terms of like the science behind it. Because once we understand that, then we can use that for benefit elsewhere.
I think it has something to do with the light that passes through the atmosphere.
The light that passes through the atmosphere. Again, so you're listing down possibilities here.
Right.
Really, like say which one is the actual thing, or what could be possibilities. So one of the possibilities here is the light that passes through the atmosphere. Okay.
Right.
What other possibilities? Or other possibilities that you know, or that somebody else might say, for example. I mean, someone mentioned something to do with elements in the atmosphere. Okay. Another person said water. Okay. Other ones?
Because space is very dark, so only a small amount of light from the sun gets through. I'm just coming up with an explanation.
Yeah, okay. So we're just exploring different possibilities, because this is essentially some of what happens in terms of science. So whatever information that you might have been exposed to before, you're going to try to see if some of that could be could be used to determine the answers here. Okay, what else could you what else could somebody reference back to and then frame or try to understand in the context of this like blue, the sky being blue? Let's come up with like one or two other possibilities. Okay, something with the sun. One more.
One layer of the atmosphere is blue.
Oh, okay. Oh, one of the atmosphere. Yeah. So these are some possibilities that people might think of. Okay, let's see what the answer is.
Just give me a couple minutes and I'll let you know why. This is the world's most asked questions. The sky is blue because of three things. Light from the sun, particles in our atmosphere, and the fact that you're a human. I'll get to that last part in just a minute, but let's start with how sunlight interacts with particles in the sky. I'm not talking about dust or water droplets or other big particles which are sometimes mistakenly used to explain why the sky is blue. Instead, it's the very small particles in our atmosphere that make the sky look blue. I'm talking about molecules in the air itself, mostly molecular oxygen and nitrogen, O2 and N2. These molecules are super abundant in our atmosphere and so small that they're even smaller than wavelengths of visible light. And that's the key. Visible light consists of a range or spectrum of different wavelengths. Light with the longest wavelengths are at the red end of the spectrum, and light with the shortest wavelengths are at the blue and violet end. Since the blue wavelengths of light are shorter, they're more likely to strike those tiny molecules of oxygen and nitrogen more often. And when they do, they get scattered in all directions. This effect is known as Rayleigh scattering because it was first described by John William Strutt, aka the third Baron Rayleigh, who in 1871 published his mathematical proof that blue wavelengths of light in the atmosphere are scattered 16 times more than red wavelengths. But violet light has the shortest wavelength of all visible light, and it's scattered even more strongly by tiny particles. So why isn't the sky purple? Well, this is where being human comes into play. Our human eyes perceive the middle of the spectrum most sharply, which is why blue is way easier to see than violet. So even though violet light is being scattered around like crazy, we just don't detect it as well as we detect the blue. And that's why the violet band of the rainbow is often the hardest for us to make out. So SciShow viewers are in luck, because when we surveyed you, the most popular favorite color from the rainbow was blue. 33.55% of survey takers reported blue as their favorite color, while yellow was the least favorite at only 2.8%. Poor yellow. But there are other animals that can see all the way into the ultraviolet end of the spectrum, like honeybees and some birds. So maybe they like yellow, and maybe the sky looks completely different to them. Of all the fascinating questions in the world, what question do you want answered most? Let us know on Facebook or Twitter or in the comments down below, and we will try to answer those questions in a new video at the end of the month. And don't forget to use hashtag WMAQ, and stay tuned for more answers to the world's most asked questions.
Alright, so that is the reason why the sky is blue. Now, it took a long time for people to actually understand a lot of these things. So as you can see, like people, spent time like reflecting and like kind of experimenting and researching and so on, until they had theories that when they said, like when different theories like this or different ideas or concepts that were brought together, then the answer to this question was possible. Before that it was sort of still individual, but then like, for example, for the eyes, like why our eyes detect something more than others and stuff. So that would be somebody focusing on that, and then other people are focusing on the aspect of the scattering of the wavelengths or the waves, or the light itself and the different wavelengths, or the waves of different wavelengths. Let me say it like that. And so all of these things come together, then you have the answer to this question. So this is how science works. Now, again, they ventured certain guesses and stuff, and so you have some educated guesses that help us come up with the possibilities. All right, now we've covered two scenarios so far. This is the person who is who approaches you and talks about doubts, and then this is a lack of motivation and losing weight. So we specifically targeted the lack of motivation aspect. Okay, so we can also consider these, or something of your choice. And after that, we have the two videos that are going to really challenge certain things that we might have held deeply. So if you have something in mind that you want to go over, then we can do that, inshallah. If you don't, we can skip over to the videos, or we can skip over them temporarily and come back to them later. So either we can skip it because people don't have anything, or if you think of it later, then we can come back to them inshallah later. Okay, so it looks like there's no topic that people have in mind. So we'll skip for now. If you think of something later on, then you can mention it, inshallah. So watch the first one first to see if you have initial reactions.
My name is Scott Harrison. Just listen. This is my wife. Crash Course Philosophy is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace, share your passion with the world.
It's about time we had a serious talk about religion. The philosophy of religion is often confused with theology, which makes sense because they both take God and religion as their subjects. But theology starts with assuming that God exists and then figures out what follows, where theology might try to solve philosophical problems that might arise from a belief in God. But one thing that's never on the table in theology is simply not believing in God. Atheism is not an option. That's what separates the philosophical study of religion from the theological. Philosophers take nothing as a given, and that includes religious belief. Everything is on the table, and everything needs an argument. So no area of belief is sacred, and that means even your sacred beliefs are going to need to be examined, and evidence will need to be given. Some people say that religion is the one area where you don't need arguments, that faith alone is enough. But philosophers don't take faith for an answer. After all, I might have faith that the moon is made of green cheese. So what? Faith is definitionally unprovable, which makes it, from a philosophical perspective, not valuable. So if you're a theist, now's the time to offer some justifications for your beliefs. And if you're an atheist, it's time for you to pay attention too. No one's off the hook. We all need to pay attention to these arguments because religion is hugely important. Can you think of many things that have been as influential in shaping human history than religious belief? Probably not. So if we can get to the bottom of it, we should. I'll get to God in a minute, but first I want to go over a few things that the philosophy of religion is not. It's not about believing whatever your parents taught you, because that doesn't prove anything about the truth of a religious belief. If how you were raised proved something about religious truth, then every religion, and therefore also no religion, would be true. So how you were raised could give you a reason that you hold a certain belief, but it says nothing whatsoever about its truth. Philosophy of religion is also not the study of the Bible, because you can't use what's written in a book to prove the truth of the book. You need outside evidence. There's also a whole area of scholarship devoted to understanding the Bible by considering the time and place in which it was written, and such study can be very helpful in understanding certain things about religion. But it doesn't help us here. Philosophy of religion is also not religious anthropology or religious sociology or psychological understanding about reasons for religious belief. Those are all wonderful things that you can and should study, but they are not what we're studying here. What we are doing is considering whether we can offer arguments in support of belief in God's existence. And a long time ago, there was a man who argued that God's existence is provable, 11th century French monk Anselm of Canterbury. He offered a deductive argument for the existence of God based on what he understood to be the nature of God's being, or the definition of God. Because the study of being is called ontology, his argument and others like it are called ontological arguments. Now, what do you think God is like? Long, flowing white beard, robe to match, nice guy, hard to reach on the phone. Well, Anselm aimed a little bit higher. In fact, he thought God is, by definition, the best possible thing we can imagine. The best thing. Just try to think of the coolest, awesomest, most amazing and wonderful thing you can imagine, and whatever you're thinking of, Anselm said that God is better. He's just the best. In Anselm's words, God is that than which no greater can be conceived. So what does that mean? Well, it means that God must exist, according to Anselm. After all, he pointed out there are just two ways in which something can exist. Something can exist only in our minds and be strictly imaginary, like Santa or unicorns, or it can exist in our minds, but also in reality, like pizza and horses. Something that we can imagine, but that's also real. Anselm pointed out, and he does appear to be right about this, that any good thing would be better if it existed in reality as well as in our minds. I mean, unicorns, they're pretty great. But wouldn't they be better if they were real? Or the perfect romantic partner? Smart, funny, hot, likes the same movies and games that you do, pretty rich, would be pretty nice in your mind, but even better if they actually existed. Well, Anselm thought so too, and from there he believed he could prove God's existence. Because if we define God as the greatest thing that we can conjure up in our minds, the only thing that could possibly be greater than him would be a real version. And since we're already imagining the greatest thing possible, there can't be anything better, therefore God has to exist both in imagination and in reality. Anselm was sure that he had done it, deductively proven God's existence in a way that was immune to error. Here it is one more time, laid out as a philosophical argument. God is is the greatest thing we can think of. Things can exist only in our imaginations, or they can also exist in reality. Things that exist in reality are always better than things that exist only in our imaginations. If God existed only in our imaginations, he wouldn't be the greatest thing that we can think of, because God in reality would be better. Therefore, God must exist in reality. Anselm thought this was a tidy little argument, but one of his contemporaries, a fellow French monk named Guanelot, wasn't satisfied. He suggested that we could run the same line of reasoning to prove the existence of literally anything we can imagine. He came up with an argument with the exact same formal structure as Anselm's to prove that a mythical lost island exists. He proposed the best island I can imagine is one where I can swim and relax on a tropical beach and ski down snow-covered mountains all in one afternoon. I can imagine it, so it must exist. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the best island. There would be one better, and that one would have to be real. Basically, Guanelot said, you could make the same kind of argument to prove the existence of whatever you most wanted, but it wouldn't make it real. Anselm responded to Guanelot's criticism by saying that he'd missed the point, that the argument only works for necessary beings, of which there is only one. God. Folks, what we have right here is a classic example of the fallacy known as begging the question. A fallacy is a flaw in reasoning, something that weakens or destroys an argument, and when you beg the question, you assume the very thing you're trying to prove with your argument. By adding this idea of a necessary being to his definition of God, Anselm makes God's existence a part of the definition of God. A necessary being is one that must exist, so Anselm's response assumed the very point of contention to be true, that God exists. Other philosophers since Anselm have tried to save his argument by tweaking it in various ways, and dissenters have continued trying to deflate them. One of the most famous objections came hundreds of years after Anselm's time from the 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant offered the point that, as he put it, existence is not a predicate. A predicate is just something that's said of another object, and Kant thought Anselm's mistake was in thinking that existence is something that can be predicated upon a thing or used as a defining characteristic. For example, if a triangle exists, it necessarily has three sides, but it could be that no triangle exists at all because the idea of existence isn't part of how we define a triangle. Likewise, Kant would say, if God exists, then he must be the greatest being that we can imagine, but that does not mean that he does exist. Predicates add to the essence of their subjects, Kant explained, but they can't be used to prove their existence. British philosopher John Wisdom came up with a thought exercise that sounds a lot like a debate over an ontological argument. It's called The Parable of the Invisible Gardener, which brings us to this week's Flash Philosophy. Let's go to the thought bubble. Person A and person B return to a garden after a long absence and notice that a few of its plants are still thriving. Person A says a gardener must have been tending the garden while they were gone. Person B doubts this is true, so they agree to wait and see if a gardener shows up. After some time passes, they see no one, so person A says the gardener must be invisible. So they put up traps and bring in bloodhounds to catch him. When no one is found, person A says the gardener must be intangible as well as unsmellable, to which B replies, what's the difference between an invisible, intangible, unsmellable, entirely undetectable gardener and no gardener at all? Thanks, Thought Bubble. Can you guess who A and B are really talking about? To give you a sense of how long this back and forth has been going on among philosophers trying to either prove or disprove the existence of God, John Wisdom came up with this parable in 1944, nearly 1,000 years after Anselm and Guanelot. Today, we introduced a new area of philosophy, a philosophy of religion, and we learned about Anselm's argument for God's existence while also considering objections to that argument. An important point to note here is that both Guanelot and Kant agreed with Anselm's conclusion. They also believed in God's existence. They just thought Anselm's argument didn't prove it. So remember, you can think an argument fails even if you accept the conclusion. When this happens, you should look for a better argument in favor of your conclusion. This is exactly what Thomas Aquinas did, and we'll consider him next time. This episode is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace helps to create websites, blogs, or online stores for you and your ideas. Websites look professionally designed regardless of skill level, no coding required. Try Squarespace.
All right. So, any thoughts on this?
I thought it was confusing.
Okay. Tell me, which part?
I mean, I just think it was like very secular and just like a lot of information. And yeah, I don't know. I feel like there's this obsession with trying to like prove God, and people kind of get like lost in that whole like seeking it out. So I don't know. It was interesting, but again, I was just like overwhelmed. the information.
Okay, that makes sense. So this is going along the lines of how do we know things and stuff, right? So this is, let's see, go back to this concept right here. How do we know, right? How do we know and how do we find out things? How does knowledge work? So this is the aspect of philosophy, right? And we had talked about epistemology. Now this is also talking about, ontology. If you remember, Dr. Sharif was talking about exactly the same stuff, but he framed it obviously in the context of like the Islamic framework, and then he was talking about how philosophy looks at it and so on, right? So in this context, this is what they were talking about. We had talked a little bit before about how knowledge is, taken in and stuff, with the different, arguments about it and stuff and so on, and the back and forth that's happening in the philosophical arena, in what is known, how do you know things and stuff, how do you prove things, and how do you know if something exists or doesn't exist. So, and how do you know if something is a fact, it's not a fact? How do human beings acquire information? How do we know if that information is facts or if it's not, if it's capital truth, if it's not capital truth? How do we know all those things and stuff, right? So that's the kind of stuff that we've been focusing on, right? And so here, in this particular video, they were focusing on the question of the existence of God. Now, what they were saying is that in either case, whether you believe that God doesn't exist or you believe that God does exist, in either case, you need to be able to back it up with like strong evidence, right? And if you don't have that, you should be open to, or even if you do have it, you should be open to to counter arguments or to counter examples or whatever, or at least scrutiny in terms of your logic flow. So one of the people that had mentioned something, the first guy that they were mentioning in there from the 900s, I think they said 900 or 9th century. I don't remember which one it was, but in either case, in his argument, he was assuming the existence of a God as part of his proof. And so it was no longer a proof then, because he sort of had this underlying assumption that God exists. So at the end of the day, remember his response was, well, I was only saying this for the necessary being. In other words, I was saying that God exists, and this proof that I'm using proves that God exists by assuming that God exists, right? And so it was kind of like going in circles like that. He started off by the assumption that the necessary being must exist, and then he used the argument to like go from there and kind of assume that this only works for the existence of the God, and this is proving the existence of God, and that's it. So the flaw in that argument was that he inherently assumed the existence of God as part of the proof itself, right? And then Immanuel Kant and others and stuff, that when they explored this and stuff, they kind of went into details about where the fallacies were. But notice all of them actually did believe in the existence of God. They just didn't take the same philosophical approach, or the approach that the first guy did. They had different ways of proving the existence of God, but they all believed in the existence of God. So that was the thing over here, that they came up with, they came to the same conclusion, but they didn't take the same pathway, and they actually questioned the pathway of like the first person and so on. So keep that in mind over here, that at the end of the day, the conclusion that these people made was still the same, but the logic that led to that conclusion was not the same, and there were fallacies in those arguments. And so there are people who did, in our history, there were people who tried to use Greek philosophy, other philosophies and stuff, to try to prove the existence of God using that logic and stuff, right? But if logic is being set up by human beings who are trying to put some boundaries and rules and stuff in terms of how to debate, how to argue and stuff like that, then you can understand that sometimes there could be limitations in that, especially if not everyone agrees on certain things, right? But there are certain things that are agreed upon and stuff to an extent. So anyways, in this thing, it was just the idea of like, you got to be comfortable. If you're using a certain proof, then you should be open for that proof to be evaluated. And so this goes back over here to the questions that I was asking about evaluations, right? You're evaluating your assumptions. How do you evaluate your assumptions? How do you evaluate your proofs that you've given yourself, right? Are you open to that? Are you not open to it? Are you like sort of fixated, no, this way is the right way because I said so? Or are you open to it? Are you so confident in your approach and your process and so on, that you're like, you know what, no matter, or like, I'm open and anyone can scrutinize it, and I'm completely okay with that. Somebody can try, but I'm so solid on this stuff that I'm not gonna be, I'm not gonna be disturbed. I'm not gonna be like, bothered by anybody evaluating this. In fact, go ahead. The more everyone tries to disprove it and it turns out to be true, the stronger it'll become, right? The stronger that my proof will become, essentially, right? Because people try people try to address different possibilities of how this could be wrong, but then those possibilities of how my proof could be wrong ended up not being like true, right? And so there's more proof, therefore, that what I'm believing is true, right? Because there's like fewer possibilities of how it could be wrong and more possibilities of how it is right, right? Because somebody, let's say there was a possibility how they could be wrong, and they try to explore it, and it turned out not to be the case and stuff. So in that case, at least, that theory was not, or my proposition was not breakable or false, or like it couldn't be like my argument wasn't wrong, or it couldn't be contradicted from that route, right? And so that because of that, it's stronger in that sense. And then if you keep doing that one at a time and stuff, the more times somebody fails to disprove that theory, in that sense, that you become stronger. Now, I don't want, I'm just saying that like this. Obviously, there's a lot more, detail and caveats that you would have to consider. But nonetheless, the argument over here is saying pretty much that you should be open to the idea of being questioned if you feel that your argument is really solid. And so that is one of the reasons that we are presenting this over here and not avoiding the concept, because we are comfortable enough to have this stuff questioned when it comes to our own belief system and stuff, right? Because our belief system is actually supposed to be established on certainty, but certainty requires us to have proofs. And the ayah says, قُلْ هَاتُوا بُرْهَانَكُمْ إِن كُنْتُمْ صَادِقِينَ. Say, bring your proof if you are indeed truthful. So here it is. If we are so certain about our belief system and stuff, then we should be ready to face whatever it is that is trying to disprove it, right? So in this case, we should be really comfortable with this because it doesn't really bother us, right? We are so certain in our stuff. We have proofs and stuff that, yeah, whatever he said is true, in the sense that we do need proof, and everyone does need proof for whatever claims that they have. So this is just talking about the idea of claims and proofs and so on. So inshallah, let's watch this and then we're going to stop because we have to break for Maghrib. So let's go ahead and do this inshallah and then we'll stop.
Crash Course Philosophy is brought to you
by the way, did that make sense of the objective of that video and why we're mentioning it over here? It is supposed to be secular in the sense that it's not secular in the sense that it's not purely under the framework of Islam, or religion. They're just sort of like going in the aspect of philosophy. Our understanding of Islam is that it does encompass multiple different things, right? It does encompass Islam and Islam does encompass all the other aspects of life, and it's not just fixated on one. But their perception, the Western perception, is that there is a difference between religious focuses and the secular focuses. So that's where the separation of church and state comes in, and they have different domains or different areas of influence that they focus on, and there are some overlaps too, but ultimately the idea is to separate that and stuff, right? So you have certain things that the religious scope focuses on, and there's like the secularist or the secular or this the state focuses on certain different aspects of life. So with that, I hope that made sense of the objective of it.
Yeah, that made sense.
Okay. Now there is something that some people had used. It's called the Kalam Cosmological Argument, and it does focus on something that we're going to be focusing on here, and that is something that Imam al-Ghazali he had actually used, but it is sourced from Greek philosophy and so on. So it is not something that is necessarily Islamic in its origin. And so even if somebody, and I know that this might be taken the wrong way by certain people, but it's not inherently an Islamic argument, And even though some people do try to justify it using Quranic, verses or hadith or whatever, but it is not something that was proposed initially as an Islamic thing and stuff, right? But people try to find evidence of it after already having that idea in their mind. So this is very different than sourcing something directly from the Quran and Sunnah directly, like purely from these sources, and then applying in different places and stuff, right? Versus having an idea and then trying to prove it by finding something that relates to that idea in your text, in the Islamic science, in the Islamic sources. So it's two different approaches. One of them, you use the Islamic sciences to come up with an idea, right? Whereas in this case, you have an idea that you're trying to use the sources to back up, right? So the two different things. In one case, if you have an idea in mind that you want, you're gonna find, let's say that if you talk about an idea like hurting people, right? Let's say somebody wants to have that as an idea, and then they go to the Islamic science or sources and stuff, or any other religious sources and stuff, then they're going to look for proofs that says that it's okay to hurt people and stuff, right? They're going to find evidence for that because it's going to be out of context and stuff, and it's not what the religion might be trying to do, or the sources might be trying to guide you towards. It's just that you're just looking for proofs for whatever idea that you have. Versus on the other hand, if you're looking at the sources to come up with an idea, then that's going to be very different, because you're going to use all of the different things in context. In that case, you're saying, okay, I need to come up with an idea that is based on this stuff. In other words, I need to figure out what the direction is that's being given in the sources that is not contradicting other parts of the source. Like, let's say if you're looking at the Quran and the Sunnah, I need to come up with something that the Quran is guiding me, or the Deen is guiding me towards, that does not conflict with other aspects of the Deen itself, right? Or other aspects of the sources and stuff. Whereas the other way around is, if I come in with a preconceived idea that I try to justify using the Quran and the Sunnah. So one of them is kind of like helping you synthesize the information and come up with a conclusion from the sources, versus coming in with a conclusion and using the sources to try to prove the conclusion. Okay, so that keep that in mind. So the cosmological argument that is used a lot by many people today and has been used for a while, it is one of those things that has been sourced outside of Islam, from outside of Islam, and Imam al-Ghazali mentioned it in his thing. But a lot of people are actually using it in many circles. Certain like like Aqidah groups, I don't know like how to frame it and stuff, right? Because it's not sects necessarily, but like schools of thoughts, you can say, they actually do use Greek philosophy and other components of logic and so on, and they study that as part of their belief system, as part of their belief studies, Aqidah studies, and so they actually would use this argument in there and stuff. So just keep that in mind, where it's coming from, if it's Islamic or not Islamic, and so on. So this is the argument that's also mentioned in here.
By Squarespace. Squarespace, sharing your passion with the world.
Nothing gets people talking like proving the existence of God. Just look at the comments on our last video. And that is what Anselm of Canterbury did. He claimed in the 11th century to have come up with a deductive proof of God's existence.
So it was the 11th century. So 1000s or whatever, or 1000s or whatever you want to call it.
Existence for what we now know as the ontological argument. And if there was such a thing as a social network of medieval Christian philosophers back then, it was positively abuzz with the news for a long time. Because almost 200 years later, Italian theologian and philosopher Thomas Aquinas encountered Anselm's argument. But like many others, he just didn't buy it. Aquinas did believe in God. It was just that as a philosopher, he felt that it was important to have evidence for your beliefs. He knew that if he was going to dismiss Anselm's argument, he'd need to come up with something better. So he set out to construct 5 arguments that would prove God's existence once and for all. Yeah, 5. Apparently he was concerned that one wasn't going to do it, so he figured that out of 5, one was bound to stick. His first 4 arguments are known together as the cosmological arguments, as they seek to prove God's existence through what he argued were necessary facts about the universe.
So this is a necessary existence or necessary being argument. I don't know if you've heard that before, that ultimately there has to be a necessary like creator or being or whatever. And this is where the line of thinking came from and stuff, right? So just for context and stuff, the Prophet ﷺ, and the Sahaba and so on, are in the late, or let's say the 600s, 700s, and so on, right? So let's say between the times of 500, the late 500s, to 600s, to 700s, and 800s, if you want to, include some of the early formations of the different sects and stuff, and the beliefs that people had come up with, like the different schools of thoughts, if you want to call them that, that were offshoots essentially. This is around the time when all that is happening, and then later on, if you go into the 900s, 1000s, if you or 1000s, whatever, right? So if you go into that, that's sort of where this other guy was and stuff. And then if you go a little bit later, then you have these other people that are being mentioned over here. Now, the arguments that are being presented, Imam al-Ghazali was a few hundred years after the Prophet ﷺ. So in this case, he is presenting the cosmological argument, but it is directly sourced back from what they call kalam, ilm al-kalam, which was it's more, it's an idea of like rhetoric and stuff, and how you talk to people and stuff, and the argument, the back and forth that they had. But it does focus on, or the actual manifestation of it was based on Greek philosophy and things like that. So it was a lot about debate and arguments and stuff that you present philosophically. So it is a very philosophical thing that actually sources back again to the Greeks and others and stuff, right? And so keep in mind that that is how this discussion is taking place. So if you look at this guy over here, who is mentioning, I don't know if you can see that in there, it says kalam, cosmological argument. So he's going to look into that a little bit. But anyways, that is the argument that was presented. That is the argument that's being used today. And that is the argument that that is the philosophical mindset that is used by certain people to, like, say, for example, we can't see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the Day of Judgment because of certain things that they've come up with philosophically. Or they'll say, for example, that Allah does not have certain attributes that he describes himself with because it'll make him look like a human being, for example, and stuff, right? Again, so these are these philosophical ideas that people have borrowed from outside to try to interpret Islam via, right? But they automatically, inherently assume or preclude, meaning like, they exclude certain possibilities from the get-go, right? That's what, so you're precluding them. So what happens is when you come in, you preclude certain possibilities, then you're not going to consider them as possibilities, as you continue the discussion. So you're already excluding them at the beginning. And so this is where limitations come in, and that's where problems happen and stuff, right? So we don't really necessarily preclude things unless Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself tells us to preclude something. But on the other hand, we leave everything open to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's so many possibilities, we're not going to restrict that unless we have proof to restrict them. In this case, they come in with assumptions that preclude some of those possibilities, and those assumptions obviously are not facts, right? And then they go from there. So this is where in that conversation, you're going to have some of these other things that are coming in, like the cosmological argument. So the kalam cosmological argument is focused on by these people, like mutakallimun, who are like were present in the early phases in Iraq and areas around there, and that's where they were used. Like they initially used it to try to defend Islam from the different sects that were coming up, but then it kind of led to a certain narrowing of certain things and stuff. But anyways, this is the context. Cosmological argument.
So in keeping with the method that we discussed in our very first episode, we're going to examine these first 4 arguments of Thomas Aquinas and really try to understand them. And then we'll consider their merits and their weaknesses. Maybe the most striking thing about the cosmological arguments of Aquinas, at least to modern eyes, is that some of them are firmly based in the natural world. Even though he lived in a pretty unscientific time, Aquinas argued for the existence of God through his understanding of science, and with the help of what he thought was physical evidence. For example, the first of his cosmological arguments is known as the argument from motion. In it, Aquinas observed that we currently live in a world in which things are moving, and he also observed that movement is caused by movers, things that cause motion. Aquinas was convinced that every everything that's moving must have been set into motion by something else that was moving. By this logic, something must have started the motion in the first place. Otherwise, you'd be stuck in a philosophical quandary known as an infinite regress. You get an infinite regress when, in a chain of reasoning, the evidence for each point along the chain relies on the existence of something that came before it, which in turn relies on something even further back, and so on, with no starting point.
In other words, if God, if we were created with something else or by something else, and everything needed something to to be created, then our creator would need a creator, but that creator would in turn need another creator, and then you would keep on going with an infinite, like you would keep on going back infinitely, right? So there would be no stop. So to stop that from happening, you would put a necessary existence at the very beginning of it all that did not need a creator to go, to create it. It needed, by definition, then it had to be there to begin with, and then everything else depended on it. Okay, so that's the argument that is being used in the necessary existence in the Kalam Cosmological Argument, and so that's what he's addressing over here.
Basically, Aquinas thought the very idea of infinite regress was absurd, logically impossible, because it implied that any given series of events began with nothing, or more accurately, never really began. Instead, it could have been going on forever. In the case of physical motion, Aquinas wanted to trace the cause of...
So the idea of the beginning of something, right? If we'd have this thing like, okay, everything was started by something else and stuff, then the movement was always happening and there was no beginning to something. It was always going to have something else before it, and you would keep on going. So the concept of beginning would never be a thing anymore, right? So the idea of creation starting from something would not be there, right? And this is what this group of people, the people that use Kalam, they actually said about the Quran, for example, which is what led to the mihna, or the trial of Imam Ahmad and others and stuff, who were put in prison because of this, because they said the Quran is not created, whereas these people who were using the Kalam, the arguments and stuff, right, or the philosophy, they said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spoke the Quran because he spoke it at the moments before it. Obviously he hadn't spoken it, so therefore the Quran had a beginning because it initiated when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spoke it, right? And so therefore they said that as the logic continues, then because the Quran has a beginning, it must have been created, because all created things have a beginning, whereas Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not have a beginning, so he's divine and so on, right? So if anything has a beginning, it cannot be attributed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because then in that case Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is attributed with something that has a beginning, right? So this is where the logic kind of was going from. Obviously there is a flaw in there, and I'm not discussing the flaw, right? Because they're like, obviously you could discuss, for example, what is speech and stuff, and how does that work and stuff, and is our understanding also projected onto Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even though he's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and so all these things can be discussed, but I'm just presenting what was discussed in that context, right? And so obviously there is a flaw, but it also was dependent, this whole logic flow was not from an Islamic origin. It came from external stuff, and it was something that that was being sort of borrowed to interpret the deen. So external frames of like doing things, or the frameworks that people are using to think, they were being utilized for Islam or to understand Islam, as opposed to using to learn, as opposed to coming up with an Islamic framework from the sources themselves, right? So again, this is you bringing in your own idea, preconceived notion, to try to project onto Islam, as opposed to learn the system of Islam and then try to use that going forward. Okay, so that's the difference here.
The movement he saw in the world all the way back to its beginning, and he figured there must have been a beginning. Otherwise, for him, it would be like watching these blocks fall and being told that nothing ever pushed over the first block. Instead, they had always been falling down forever, backward into eternity. There must have been a...
So if you notice that he did that at the very beginning, the dominoes. So if they just fell, and I don't know if you saw how he did. I'm going to come back to this really quick, but notice that
abuzz with the news for a long time, because almost 200 years later, Italian theologian and philosopher Thomas Aquinas encountered Anselm. As a philosopher, he felt that it was to come up with something better. So he set 5. Apparently, he was concerned that 1 wasn't going to do it, so he figured that out of 5, 1 was bound to stick. His first 4 arguments are known to get necessary. Examine these first 4 arguments of Thomas Aquinas.
Okay, so what's the he's going to domino?
Aquinas, and really try to understand them, and then we'll consider their merits and their weaknesses.
So did you notice that they didn't show that part where the first domino fell? So that was interesting. I don't know if you paid attention to that earlier.
And there also must have been beginning. Otherwise, for him, it would be like watching these blocks fall and being told that nothing ever pushed over the first block. Instead, they had always been falling down forever, backward into eternity. There must have been a time when nothing was in motion, Aquinas thought, and there also must have been a static being that started the motion. And that being, according to Aquinas, is God, the unmoved mover. So, his argument from...
Now, this is also the concept of, I just had it in my mind, it just slipped my mind. You know the concept of inertia, right? That if something is moving, it'll keep on moving until something stops, or if something is in, at rest, it'll keep on staying at rest until something moves it. So think about it like that, okay? So in that framework.
From motion ran something like this. Objects are in motion. Everything in motion was put into motion by something else. There can't be an infinite regress of movers, so there must be a first...
There can't be an infinite regress of movers, and that is the assumption that's being, or that is the claim over here that needs proof.
Mover itself unmoved, and that is God. Now, the second cosmological argument of Aquinas was a lot like his first one. Here he proposed the argument from causation, and it too sets out to avoid the problem of an infinite regress. But instead of it explaining the motion of objects, it set out to explain causes and effects in general all over the universe. The argument went along these lines. Some things are caused. Anything that's caused has to be caused by something else, since nothing causes itself. There can't be an infinite regress of causes, so there must have been a first causer, itself uncaused, and that is God. Just like...
So again, there can be an infinite regress of causes is the issue over here.
With the argument for motion, the point here is pretty simple. Effects have causes. If you think about how you wound up watching this video, you can trace the line of causation back from moment to moment. If you think about it long enough, you can probably go pretty far back. But Aquinas said, again, it can't go back forever. There had to be a first thing that started off the chain of causes and effects, and that thing is God. Argument number 3 was the argument from contingency. And we should step back and get a little background for this one. In philosophy, we often distinguish between necessary beings and contingent beings.
Now notice the difference over here, but it is something that is necessary. This is fundamental to the argument, the cosmological argument and so on. This is sort of like the basis over here.
Contingent being is, simply put, any being that could have not existed. That includes you. Sure, you do exist, but you could not have. If you had never been born, the world would go on. And yes, things would be different. We've all seen It's a Wonderful Life, but the world would go on. Instead, your existence is merely contingent.
So contingent is not necessary, and things could have worked out even without that thing, but it's there, right?
On the existence of other things. In your case, you only exist because a certain sperm met a certain egg and swapped some genetic information. You're basically a fluke. But what does that have to do with God? Well, again, Aquinas believed that there had to be something that prevented an infinite regress of contingency. That would mean that the contingency on which everything existed would just keep going back in time.
In other words, contingency over here, that something depends on something else, which depends on something else, which depends on something else, you would have this infinite regress of that, right? Meaning backwards, you'd have to go all the way back, like infinite, right? Like you just have to keep going back because there'd be no beginning. And so he's saying because that doesn't make sense, that this philosopher is saying that because that doesn't make sense to have that infinite regress, therefore there must be a stop or like an origin or like a starting point that does not go backwards even beyond that, right? And so he's saying that is God.
Time. And we can't have a world where everything is contingent, Aquinas said, because then, by definition, it all could easily have never existed. So he needed at least one necessary being, a being that has always existed, that always will exist, and that can't not exist.
Okay, so in the context of the world, it could have been not existed, and everything else could have not existed. But because he's saying because that's not, like, that doesn't make sense, because things would not have existed. If they could have not existed, they wouldn't have existed, right? If they could have not existed, then therefore they would not have existed, which means that we wouldn't be alive and stuff. But because we exist and stuff and all that stuff, then, that's the logic here. Therefore, there must be a necessary existence and so on.
In order to get everything going, and that necessary being is God. Aquinas spelled out the reasoning of his argument from contingency this way. There are contingent things. Contingent things can cause other contingent things, but there can't only be contingent things, because...
So that is an assumption here, or at least in this context. But there can only be contingent things, because that would mean that there's an infinite regress. And again, going back to the idea of infinite regress. Why is infinite regress not okay? And that is something that he would have to justify separately.
That would mean that there's an infinite regress of contingency and a possibility that nothing might have existed. An infinite regress is impossible, so there must be at least one necessary thing, and that is God. Let that marinate in your brain for a minute while unpacking the next argument. This one is built on the idea that we simply need a measuring stick in order to understand the value of things. Good, bad, big, small, hot, cold, none of these concepts can exist in isolation. If you go out for a walk and you see an animal, it's like this big. That animal would be on the small side if it turned out to be a dog. But if it were a rat, that would be huge. How do we know? Because we gauge the size of things in terms of other things. The same idea applies to more abstract concepts, like your grades. How do we know that an A is good? Because it's at the top. We know that there are grades lower than an A, but nothing higher. And Aquinas thought that all our value concepts would just be floating randomly in space if there weren't some anchor, something that defined the value of everything else by being perfect. And that, again, is God. This is how Aquinas developed number 4, known as argument from degrees. Properties come in degrees. In order for there to be degrees of perfection, there must be something perfect against which everything else is measured.
So the idea of like why evil must exist, for example, because it gives you perspective about what's good and what's not good and all that stuff. Because if everything was all the same, then how would you know that murder is bad? Because if it was the same thing as everything else, like, you know, donating to charity was the same thing as murder because you couldn't tell the difference between them, right? There's no criteria to differentiate, then in that case, everything would be the same. Right, so that, like, this is where that is coming from.
God is the pinnacle of perfection. Okay, we've considered Aquinas' 4 cosmological arguments, but remember, that's only step 1. The next and equally important step in philosophy is critical evaluation. So what do we make of them? As philosophers, if you think an argument is flawed, it's your job to try and figure out why. And by and large, philosophers, theists and atheists alike, have been relatively unimpressed by these 4, having found many problems in them. For one thing, these arguments don't seem to establish the existence of any particular God. Even if the arguments are correct, it doesn't look like Aquinas gets us to the personal, loving God that many people pray to. Instead, we're left with unmoved movers and uncaused causers who...
Okay, so right here, I want to pause for a second. I want to show you something. So if we say that there is, let me go to natural, nature. Let's go to nature. All right, so nature. Let's go to this right here. Okay, so the specific one we're looking at is this one. A creative and controlling force, that's important here. Creative and controlling force in the universe. This is sort of the application of, this is the definition that is used for, like, you know, the laws of nature and stuff like that. So this is the creative or natural force. So let's type in force. What does force mean? Because we need to understand the definition of each word that we're using. So the force over here is the strength or energy exerted or brought to bear, the cause of motion or change, right? So this is something that's causing things to move. So that's the force. When we go back, in that sense, we look at this definition, it says a creative and controlling causer of movement in the universe. That's what this definition is, right? So let's continue from here, the causes of motion or change. Let's see if we can find some other ones. Okay, so some sort of like movement, some sort of something that causes movement and stuff, right? So like a push or a pull. So in other words, let's go back here and type in force. So something that makes, you know, something that causes some movement and stuff like that. So like a push or a pull. In physics, let's go to the physics definition. Did I spell it right? Physics. Alright, so what is a force? So a force is a push or pull. So force is a push or pull that acts upon an object as a result of that object's interaction with surroundings. So again, the idea is that there is some push or pull, And in here we were talking about nature, and nature is that creative or controlling force that's causing that movement to take place and stuff, right? So this is how you're going to define it in science and so on. The idea of push and pull, and the idea that there is a creative force or like controlling force behind things and stuff. Now this is, you might be able to prove that this is how, like, this is to the extent that you're going to go to, but how do you prove that something is like kind or merciful or whatever and stuff, right? If you have proven now that there is something that exists that's controlling it, right? Whether you call it Mother Nature, whether you call it nature, whether you call it the Father in heaven, you call it God, you call him Allah, whatever it is, what is the attribute? What are the attributes that go with that being or that thing that exists that's causing all this movement or controlling how things work and stuff?
Who seem to have little in common with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who feels emotions and cares about his creation and answers prayers. Basically, this objection says that Aquinas' God is so far removed from the God that theists actually believe in that it doesn't help anything. But maybe you're happy just believing someone's out there, that's fine. But then, how about multiple someones? Because guess what? Aquinas' arguments don't rule out polytheism. There's nothing in any of his arguments to prove that God isn't actually like a committee. Aquinas'
So if you look at the reincarnates of, or like the subcomponents of the God that the Hindus believe in, right? So like they have different subcategories. Like for example, there's the main one, and then there's like the different, I don't want to say components or like, but like different manifestations. I don't know the right word for it. But like let's say like different reincarnates or something like that. Let's use that word here. Obviously that's not necessarily the word that's used, so don't take that word outside of this, but nonetheless, if you have the subcomponents or the reincarnates and stuff that are components and they focus on certain aspects that are attributed eventually to the main God, but they're given in components and stuff, right? So for example, there and this is sort of like the idea of the Roman and Greek mythology, that they have gods and goddesses that are separate. But if you were to consolidate all of them into one overall, like one God, and there's some sort of like some just subcomponents that are focusing on different attributes that would then be ultimately attributed to the main God, then in that case you would have gods and goddesses and stuff, right? That each of them are focusing on certain things. Like you can have the God of love and God of goddess of wisdom or whatever and stuff, but they're subcomponents. So from an Islamic perspective, we believe Allah Ta'ala has multiple different attributes and stuff, right? In one by himself. And I'm saying himself obviously because that's the default when you don't have a gender. We know it just, the language just uses like the he pronoun, but it's not that it doesn't necessarily mean that that's specifically referring to a male. But nonetheless, the idea is that Allah Ta'ala has all those attributes. Whether it's whether other people divide them up into different individual gods or subcomponents, or if they treat him as one. But anyways.
Cosmological arguments also don't prove the existence of a sentient God. So it might be an old guy with a beard, it might be 6 old guys with beards, but it also might be an egg or a turtle or just a big block of stone. These observations have made some philosophers uncomfortable with Aquinas' ultimate conclusion. But
so the reason he was saying about a rock, because yeah, there could be like unmovable mover and stuff, the ultimate cause, but sentient being, there's again, you have to define what the word sentient means, and like in this context, how would you prove sentient? Remember, we were going back to all the possibilities that could be, but how do you actually prove each of those aspects? Because we were talking about the idea of the sky. Well, you could focus on certain aspects, but then for each of those aspects, you have to be able to prove it. We talked about like the idea of the eye, and the eye can perceive certain colors better than other colors. So that was something that you had to prove separately. And then the idea of like the sky, the scattering of the light, was another thing that had to be proven separately. And when all of those things were synthesized, like all these things were brought together, then you can say, oh, this is why we see the sky as blue, right? Why is the sky blue? Inherently, why is the sky blue to us, right? That's the inherent question that we're trying to ask, even though we're phrasing it. Why is the sky blue? As if it was necessarily blue. So we're assuming that it is blue for everything and everyone that looks at it, right? Whereas the Prophet ﷺ, for example, mentioned about Jibreel alayhi salam, and when he was in the sky, his wings, there was like jewels and rubies and stuff that were falling from his wings, and the Prophet ﷺ saw it. And so ultimately, like if human beings were not seeing it, but the Prophet ﷺ was allowed to see it, And when it comes to jinn, for example, you can see, or even dreams and stuff like that, you might see them to the extent that they might let you see themselves or whatever, but it doesn't mean that they're actually visible to everyone, right? Because you're having a dream, but it's not visible to other people. Or sometimes people see jinn and stuff like that in certain forms, but then doesn't mean that everyone else is seeing them and stuff, right? So the idea is over here again to kind of like focus on like there's different things that you're gonna have to look at, and when they are brought together, then you can move forward. So the sentient thing about the rock, the argument isn't to like mock anyone. It's to say that, look, we've gotten only to a certain extent, but if you're gonna give more attributes to God or whatever, then in this case, philosophically, you would have to prove the extra characteristics. You have to prove that it's like this thing is sentient, whatever that definition that we're going to be using it for sentient would necessitate.
Two objections that are thought by some to be real nails in its coffin. The first is simply that Aquinas was wrong in his insistence that there can't be an infinite regress of anything.
So this is what I was talking about, that assumption over there.
Aquinas takes it as a given that there had to be a starting point for everything, whether it's the movement of objects or causes and effects or contingent beings being created.
So this is something that, practically speaking, I don't personally, my opinion, right, is that I don't think this is an answerable question. Because how would you actually go back in time and like evaluate whether or not there was, an origin to things, right? Because in hindsight, going backwards, for us, we haven't found a way to like go back in like at the very beginning and try to figure out if there was a beginning or not. And so this is not something that is testable necessarily. So this is something that may not fall into the realm of, for example, science, right? It might fall into the realm of philosophy, but only some components of philosophy would enter into the realm of like science in the context of experimental science, where you actually would be able to experiment on it, right? So this is something that would not be an argument that would be able to be provable or falsifiable, meaning it cannot be tested upon. Falsifiable means it can be proven false, whereas non-falsifiable claims are those that inherently do not allow you to be able to prove them or not prove them. Like this is some of the stuff that Freud was doing, Sigmund Freud, when he was proposing certain things that were not falsifiable, so you couldn't prove if he was right or wrong, right? And so it was sort of like, that's it, like you just make claims that nobody can test, and so that's it, right? In this case, it seems that this is one of those things that you cannot really prove whether this is true or not. And so because of this, this question that philosophers might keep thinking about for thousands of years and not get an answer to, it's not practically useful for us. It doesn't seem that we're going to be able to find an answer because we can't go back in time, at least at the moment, right? To go back in time to see if there is an infinite regress or not. And if there was an infinite regress, you wouldn't be able to prove it because you would have to keep going back and back and back and back and stuff, right? You might go back like, 30 iterations, or you might go back 500 million iterations, or you might go back like, 50 billion iterations. But at the end of the day, you're not going to be able to get to the original, because if we're saying that it's infinite regression, then there is a possibility that, anything less than infinite would be the ones that be testable. But if it's infinite, you always have like, this perpetual, like, movement going back and back and back, like until forever. But if we're saying that it's not infinite regression, then one of the possibilities could be that like you have to go maybe like, like 5 million billion, like quadrillion years, or like iterations back, and then that would be the one, right? One less than infinity, let's say. One less than infinity, and of course there's nothing like you can't reach infinity, so that concept is not real. But what I'm saying is not real in that sense. But I'm trying to make a point over here that like you have to go through and exhaust the entire spectrum until you reach infinity, and then you say, okay, well, I've tried every possibility, right? I've gone through every iteration that I could have gone through, and then I've proven that wrong and stuff, right? So that's why it's not possible to actually address this from a scientific perspective, which means that this is an argument that we're not going to be able to confirm. So if we don't accept something in this case, then we are sort of not going to functionally benefit from this. And if this is the case, then we're going to be stuck at this philosophical dilemma for centuries to come. And practically, we're not going to be able to benefit because we're not going to be able to prove or disprove this concept. And therefore, we're not going to be able to disprove or prove the existence of God. And so we are stuck at a crossroads that we're not going to be able to, resolve. And functionally, people are gonna many lives are gonna pass, and we're not gonna know any answers. So if there was a God, for example, from a philosophical perspective, then we would come to face him not knowing, not having done what he asked us to do, even though the answers were presented because they were presented, and we were just stuck trying to still prove his existence. So I hope that made sense of why philosophically this is a dilemma.
But it's unclear that this is true, or why it has to be true. If infinite regress can be possible, then Aquinas' first two arguments fall apart. But perhaps the most significant charge made against Aquinas' arguments is that they're self-defeating. That is, they actually prove themselves wrong. For example, if Aquinas is right that everything must have been put into motion by something else, and everything must have a cause other than itself, then it seems that God should be subject to those same stipulations. And if God is somehow exempt from those rules, then why couldn't other things be exempt from them too? If they can exist without God being responsible for them, then we don't need God to establish things in the first place. All right, I feel like I've given you a lot to think about. So before we close, let's pause and remind ourselves about a couple of things. First, you can accept a conclusion but reject an argument. So you might agree with Aquinas that God exists, but think none of his arguments prove it. Second, if you disagree with an argument, you don't just get to say, yeah, you're wrong. You have to give a counter-argument. What did Aquinas get wrong, and how can you do better? Why are your reasons superior to his? Remember, philosophy is a dialectic. Yes, Aquinas has been dead for centuries, but he started a conversation, and you get to participate in that when you engage with his arguments and offer your own, either in an effort to help him out by fixing flaws in his arguments while preserving his conclusion, or by refuting his entire project. This is what it means to do philosophy, to engage with arguments about stuff that matters, and whether or not there's a God seems to matter quite a bit, particularly in the lives of theists. Today, we learned about cosmological arguments and considered 4 of them. Next time, we'll look at Aquinas' 5th argument, the teleological argument. This episode of Crash Course Philosophy is made possible by Squarespace.
All right, that was the last one. I know there's a lot to think about. So, and this is a very fundamental topic, because the capital T truth arguments versus this lowercase t truth is, for us at least as Muslims, bound to those things, right? By our proof and understanding of this, right? But for a lot of people who are stuck in this limbo, not being able to prove, they don't have that anchor and stuff like that, because they haven't, they haven't accepted that. And so because of that, they don't have a source for capital T truths, and necessarily capital T truths in the context of purpose in life and so on and stuff, right? And so with that in mind, I want you to think about how that could impact people, in terms of functionality in day-to-day lives and stuff, how that could relate to things like what people expect, what they want and stuff, how depression could work and stuff from this angle. I'm not talking about where it's functionally there's certain things and stuff where brain might have had permanent damage, or maybe there was something that happened in terms of development and stuff that impacted it, or over the course of life and stuff something happened and stuff that impacted it and stuff, right? But overall, how could the aspect of depression, or the aspects of depression, or the types of depression that are linked to this stuff, the mindset and how people think and stuff, and whether they have capital T truths or not and stuff, their assumptions and all that, how that could impact people if they're stuck in step 1, not being able to figure out if God exists or not and stuff, right? So, and even if there is something that exists, what is the guidance it's providing? Is it providing guidance and stuff? If this is a discussion that's happening for the past few millennia, right? How could that have impacted people in a negative way, and how may that impact people in the future, and how to actually try to address some of those things, So with that, I'm gonna pause over here. If you guys have any comments and stuff, let's save them for next time, because we have to pause for Maghrib as well. So inshallah, next time we will continue. And again, I want you to question your own assumptions to figure out what you have assumed, to see if there are better assumptions, if there are no capital T truths known to you, or if there are capital T truths known, how can you replace your assumptions with them, and to be very deliberate and conscious about this process, and not to let this sort of be sidelined, or be some things that you're not really thinking about and so on. Don't let it be don't be not deliberate. I want you to be very, very deliberate, thoughtful about everything that you do, why you do it, and how you do it and stuff, and think about assumptions associated with it, because that gives you certainty and so on, and it also helps you prevent some of the things that happen, like systemic racism and things like that. So with that, we're gonna close. Subhanakallahumma bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Jazakumullahu khairan.